Okay, it's nice to be back in this library, in this town, city. Is this on?
I don't think so.
There we go. Okay, so it's nice to be back. This talk grows very directly out of the seminars that I offered the last 2 years here. So this may be boringly repetitive or satisfying for those of you who were in on the beginnings of them. Recent discussions on images of migration have been dominated, understandably, by photojournalism, video, and other documentary forms of reportage or commemoration. The stories and the images from the ruins, the beach, the boat, the path, the camp, or the highway, especially when taken by the travelers themselves, have an undeniable power and privilege in representing this catastrophe that we uncomfortably nickname the refugee crisis. Sometimes these static images, though, can underestimate the importance of the journey itself, the fact and experience of movement, and thus lose sight of the rupture and the demand inherent in the act of migration, the claim to move, to a right to move that's implied and sometimes made explicit when people take flight from where they live and set out for a better place. Maps can help make this more evident. But there's more than one kind of map, and it's important to see a range of them. Maps, like other images, can move from context to context and acquire different meanings and powers in that reframing. A story told by the Swiss filmmaker and activist Charles Heller, who some of you met last year, exemplifies the complexity of this migration of images of migration. In 2004, he and other activists became alarmed by developments in Swiss policies on immigration and asylum. Laws, he says, that effectively illegalized anyone whose asylum demand the Swiss authorities refused to consider. The goal of these new regulations was, he says, not only to deprive asylum seekers of access to social aid, but to actually make these people disappear into clandestinity or elsewhere. The phrase disappear is, he's quoting from another asylum activist in Switzerland. Heller responded to this with a film, Nemne, about Africans living, or staying alive at least, in the streets and parks of the Swiss city of Solothurn. In the film, they testify to the hardships and fragility of their lives, while activists supply the legal and political analysis of the ways in which social welfare aid has become an instrument of repression, and politicians go about their work of exclusion. Heller distributed the film widely through activist and NGO networks, including a screening before the UN's Human Rights Council in Geneva. He described the testimonial strategy as, quote, typical of migration films. They are grounded in the belief that if these voices are heard and the political condition that led to them grasped by the public, this will lead to mobilization and eventually to a change in policy, unquote. 3 years later, he learned the details of one of the so-called perception management campaigns run by the International Organization for Migration with Swiss funding in sub-Saharan Africa. A Swiss newspaper published a video made by the IOM on its website, framed by the title, "This is How We Scare Africans." A young man from Cameroon calls home on a dark, rainy night from Europe and lies to his father about his new life there. The film, in a split screen, shows us the reality, living on the street, begging, harassed by the police. The moral of the story is written on the screen at the end. Leaving is not always living. Don't believe everything you hear. Obviously, intentionally, the European scene shown in the video is grim. Housing and jobs are non-existent, the people are hostile, the police are omnipresent, and so on. Exactly the effects of the policies that Heller had aimed to call attention to and denounce in the film. The images are remarkably similar. You might even imagine that the IOM's production team had watched Heller's film. As Heller says, the campaign thus created a fictionalized representation of the very same inhumane living conditions I had documented and criticized in my video, unquote. On purpose and for the opposite reasons, reusing more or less the same images. He says, the shocking spectacle of the suffering of migrants was used not to denounce, but to justify and deepen the migration regime that produced it in the first place, all the while covering it with a humanitarian varnish, unquote. So the counter-moral of Heller's story is direct. There's nothing automatically progressive, emancipatory, revelatory, or even just critical about taking or showing pictures of refugees or people on the move or people in need of assistance. The activist's caravan is always just a short step away from turning into an invasion, to quote recent American discourse. As Thomas Lacour writes of humanitarian narratives, images too, quote, sentimental or otherwise, do not come with built-in moral gyroscopes, unquote. What matters, as always, is the context, the framing, the deployment, the projects into which those images are inscribed. And even those contexts can never secure their contents absolutely against further appropriation or reversal. The same image can function very differently as it moves from context to context, and there's nothing holding it in place. Keeping that caution in mind, I want to return to the notion of the map and discuss a range of different cartographic representations of migration across the Mediterranean over the last few years. Working with Sohrab Mohebi, who some of you met probably with me here a couple of years ago, and assisted by Beatrice Abbott and Basil Al-Yazuri, I gathered these images for a project called It Is Obvious from the Map. We drew extensively on research by other migration scholars as well. Our title was a quotation from a text scribbled onto one of the maps we discovered. And the material we investigated emerged out of the movement of people, primarily from conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, toward Europe in the so-called long summer of migration of 2015. We were interested in maps that seemed to play more than just a representational role in the practices of and debates over migration. Images that aspired to be useful, to get things done, to make a difference. Now, if anything would be obvious about maps, their practicality would be at the top of the list. Maps are meant to be, although they can always exceed or evade this definition, instrumental images, devices for orienting and navigating, for getting you from here to there, or helping you understand exactly where here is, or warning you about what's around the bend, or keeping track of your property or your enemy. They divide up the land and the sea and the air, mark them off with lines, and ultimately grids that put faraway places into relationship with one another. The relation is not always benign. Maps, as is well known, have a long colonial and imperial history. They have been instruments of domination, exploitation, categorization, classification, invasion, exclusion, surveillance, and control since the beginning. Maps almost always have an interventionist dimension. As Laura Kurgan has shown, maps make choices, carry assumptions, argue, and claim things. This has certainly been the case in the construction of the European and North American, but I'm not going to talk much about that, border regime over the last 2 or more decades. Maps have not simply noted or marked the borders. Maps have been essential elements in the enforcement and management of those borders and the externalization of them as well. Their functions run along a wide spectrum, from public relations device to real-time sensor-driven interactive databases that allow resources and assets to be directed to the theater of operations. Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, along with its associated state and international authorities, has been a prodigious producer and consumer of these maps, and this is a Frontex map. The most extraordinary product, at once a research tool and an intervention, is the interactive IMAP, developed by an EU research institute called the International Center for Migration Policy Development. As two scholars of mapping and migration argue, IMAP was designed to develop a new sensibility among border and migration management agencies of the complexities of migrant flows. The IMAP project advanced a new cartographic thinking of the border based on controlling flows rather than, or in addition to, hardening lines. Copies of the IMAP are posted in Frontex and border guard offices of various state bodies. IMAP, as part of an emerging transnational bordering regime, operates by seeking not so much to end irregular migration, but to play a part in harnessing and channeling its turbulence. And you can see that the focus is on the routes, right? Not the borders. The borders are almost invisible, but the pathways of movement. And here's another version. This is a Frontex surveillance map, where again, you see very few borders and a lot of big arrows. Images of the IMAP are a static representation of an interactive database, but they document and figure the investment in surveillance, data collection, trend spotting, and route identification, both toward and within Europe, that Frontex has made and made much of. Although vast and comprehensive, IMAP offers a very particular perspective. Rogier van Riekum and Willem Schinkel argue that, quote, IMAP's visualizations reduce the multiplicity of migration data into more readily understandable maps that display common migration routes and tactical points of intervention, in light of which new visa policies, risk profiles, codes of conduct at checkpoints, or border technologies may be selected, justified, or implemented. And in the IMAP, in the interactive database, if you're in a border station between Hungary and Serbia, you can hover your cursor over that spot on the map, and it will give you real-time information on who has crossed that, who is crossing that border, who has crossed, what's known about them, and so on. So it's a very, very rich database, just kind of visualized in this map. The map and a virtual library of others like it aim to describe the territory of Europe and its southern neighbors in order to control and channel the movement of people. It aspires to spatial and temporal accuracy, but it is, as they say, far from disinterested. This is the world seen from the checkpoint. Typically, lines and arrows indicate people on the move, providing the onlooker with clues about hotspots, hubs, and high-risk zones. They do not merely display Europe, but do so from the particular vantage point of securitized mobility. That's Schinkel and van Riekum again. The focus on what's beyond the borders of Europe is notable, as Maribel Casas-Cortez and Sebastian Covarrubias have insisted. The maps show us quite graphically what has come to be called border externalization, the extension and hardening of the Schengen border and of the responsibility for its policing, not just to and at the northern edge of the Mediterranean, where the so-called Dublin countries are, but across it and into Africa and the Middle East. So you can see on this map, Africa is bigger, the part of Africa represented is bigger than the part of Europe that's represented. And Europe, areas of concern for Europe start at the very bottom of this map. The European border control regime happens far beyond its legal borders, thanks to a series of cooperative and sometimes imposed arrangements, one that often follow the pathways laid out in the colonial era. France works with its former colonies, Italy with Libya, and so on. The IOM's perception management campaign in Cameroon was another instance of that. These cartographic visualizations are efforts at gaining a certain sort of mastery or control over what is, often intentionally, a very disorderly, clandestine, ad hoc, or situational process. The maps seek, as Van Rinkum and Schinkel write, to create coherent pictures of quite incoherent phenomena, not just to represent them, but to intervene in them, and not to stop, which is impossible, but to manage and to channel them. But what happens when, following a sort of reverse trajectory to the one exemplified by Heller's story that I started with, the control maps move out of state control? Because the state is not the only one making maps. The state is not the only one using the state's maps either, but that's another story. Migration rights activists by now have quite a long history of counter-mapping for a variety of purposes and in a variety of aesthetics. Among the most advanced and creative are the representations of cross-Mediterranean migration developed by forensic oceanography, a group headed by Heller, the Swiss filmmaker, and Lorenzo Pisani, emerging from the broader context of the forensic architecture program in London. Pursuing a practice that they call disobedient sensing, they've conducted a series of investigations that aim to represent complex interactions on the high seas, where traditionally human activity has been thought to leave few traces. They first explored the case of the so-called Left to Die boat, a small craft from Libya that, in spite of numerous encounters with NATO warships and aircraft, was abandoned to drift in the waters between Lampedusa at the top of the map and the Libyan coast for 2 weeks in the spring of 2011 at the cost of 63 lives. They moved from this dramatic story of non-assistance to what might seem its opposite, namely the catastrophe that ensued when the EU terminated its rescue and interception operation in the central Mediterranean and outsourced search and rescue to large commercial vessels. They called this episode, Heller and Pisani called this episode, Death by Rescue, marked as it was by 2 mammoth shipwrecks or collisions that killed more than 1,200 people in a single week in April of 2015. Most recently, they've investigated the criminalization of rescue in the Mediterranean and the EU's reliance on the so-called Libyan Coast Guard for rescue operations that should be more properly called pushbacks or pullbacks of people on the high seas to ports where their safety is far from guaranteed. All of these case studies, and this is a reconstruction that they did of the route that this drifting boat took. So the vertical line going up is based on data from the boat itself, and the dot just on the far side of the dotted line there is when the boat started to drift, and it drifts back in the reverse direction to the Libyan coast, and that they had to construct out of other resources. All of these case studies center around the production of detailed, time-based, data-rich maps, and in each case, the maps are made to describe places that are rarely, if ever, represented cartographically as anything other than empty blue space. In the Left to Die boat case, they collected, assembled, extracted, produced, and visualized an extraordinary range of data to describe these 2 weeks. Starting with testimonies from the 9 survivors, which had barely been heard, they brought together the following: documents and signals and photos and video from the NATO naval assets, as they call them, ships and planes operating in the region, including the only photograph available of the migrants' boat, which was taken by a French helicopter, and information about the deployments of the NATO ships operating in the area and their approximate locations. That's first element of data. Plane spotter photos from hobbyists that enabled the identification of the aircraft that the survivors said they had encountered. 3, historical maps and charts describing fishing and travel routes. 4, government maps of search and rescue zones, and those are some of the dotted lines in this map here. 6, records of the distress signals sent by the migrants and relayed by government agencies. 7, GPS data from the satellite telephone the migrants used in their first days at sea, and the testimony of the people that they called on the satellite phone. 8, automated tracking data of the large commercial vessels in the region. 9, synthetic aperture radar imagery, so weather imagery, also showing large vessels. 10, and perhaps most importantly, the current and wind data that allowed the calculation of the probable path of the boat after it ran out of fuel and was abandoned to drift. As they write, we sought to put into practice a disobedient gaze that used some of the same technologies, the same sensing technologies of border controllers, but sought to redirect their spotlight from unauthorized acts of border crossing to state and non-state practices violating migrants' rights. Okay, so inverting the investigative gaze to visualize a different sort of what they are calling criminal behavior, and this time state crimes rather than migrant crimes. The map is complex and yet simple. It shows a more or less linear journey north from Libya toward Lampedusa, and then the sudden end of that path and its displacement by a wandering drift that ultimately led back to the Libyan coast. But in that simple story is not only the vast resources of testimony and imagery and data, but also the stakes. The map shows the very high probability that the survivors, who told of repeated encounters with warships and aircraft in what were at the time probably the most intensively patrolled waters on Earth, because it was the middle of the Libyan civil war, the probability that the survivors told the truth about the capacity and the failure of those ships to rescue them. And the stories of the survivors needed that corroboration because NATO and the governments whose vessels were most likely involved denied all responsibility for the non-rescue of the passengers, in spite of their testimonies. The maps and their background data form the core of a series of lawsuits filed in European courts against the navies in question. The forensic oceanography map is the document of an otherwise barely documented journey, the trace of a crime that might otherwise have left next to no traces, and an indictment of the border and migration policies that have forced people onto small boats for a dangerous crossing in the first place. The desert is somewhat like the sea, and the desert that stretches across the border between the United States and Mexico has likewise been the scene of migration, death, and a state strategy that weaponizes the environment as a would-be deterrent against crossing. There, too, activists are forensically charting the spaces of death and disappearance as a means of confronting those state strategies. The Abuse Documentation Working Group, a joint project of the NGOs La Coalición de Derechos Humanos and No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, pardon my Spanish, has mapped and denounced the death and disappearance of border crossers there in a pair of reports called Disappeared: How the U.S. Border Enforcement Agencies Are Fueling a Missing Persons Crisis. The Arizona-based NGO Humane Borders, working with local governments, has compiled a series of maps marking the locations of thousands of deaths in the Sonoran Desert. The maps have a brutal factuality to them. The Humane Borders people, describe them as stark and perhaps unsettling. So each of those dots is a body that's been found or a grave that's been uncovered. Viewers may see, quoting them, the exact location where each migrant body has been found, along with other information, such as the time and gender of the deceased, if known, and if the family has been notified, date of discovery, and cause of death. The maps are at once a memorial, a call to action, a gesture of sympathy to the families, and a practical device for intervention. The patterns of death that emerge, especially over the 2-decade duration of the maps, can guide humanitarian and rescue projects that offer resources, particularly water, to prevent deaths in the future. So the same strategy of mobilizing or focalizing resources by the relentless compilation of data that fuels the state, the IMAP, also generates the forensic oceanography map, and these maps as well. It's just that the identification of the problem is radically different. As in the Mediterranean, these borderlands search and rescue projects are now themselves the target of state policing and harassment, including the criminalization of rescue itself. So the No Mas Muertes people, some of them in Arizona, are now facing incredible prison sentences, potentially. But activist migration, so I've been sort of spending a lot of time on the techie details and the assemblage of data in these maps to underline or to emphasize the fact that these kind of very high-powered military-grade operations can be run by NGOs, by underfunded, voluntary, civic organizations. But the activist migration maps are not always so high-tech. Other activists have used simpler representational strategies to tell equally complicated stories. Members of the Serbian art collective SCART, working with the humanitarian and human rights group called Grupa 484 in a camp at Bogavada outside of Belgrade, have developed an innovative protocol for challenging what they call the classic traps of humanitarian pity and helping the suffering. As SCART's George Balmozovic put it, they wanted to approach those stuck in this asylum center outside of Belgrade, not as victims, quote, but as courageous people who, by the very fact that they had decided to set out for such a journey, made a radical change in their life. SCART's strategy for documenting and representing this was narrative. We asked them, he says, why they had embarked on such a journey, what troubles they had survived, how they had crossed the borders, how much they had paid the smugglers, about their experience with the police and with the people of the countries they had passed through. Unquote. These are questions that one might ask a new friend or fellow traveler, but in SCART's hand, they became the material for a rich representation of the practices that informed the journeys. The questions turned into an investigative rubric, the results of which were maps. Together with them, the people in the center, Balmozovic said, we sketched the answers in the form of maps in order to piece together their routes, some of which had lasted up to 7 years. So this is a journey, I hope you can see it, yeah. From Damascus, a classic Syrian journey, you could say, from Damascus to Turkey, by boat to Greece, and then through Macedonia to Serbia, and then they were stalled at the Serbian-Hungarian border and captured by Serbian police and put into this camp. Sorry, I abbreviated that quotation from Balmozovic. Together, we sketched the answers in the form of maps in order to piece together their routes, which in some cases lasted up to 7 years. Sometimes the maps lack details, sometimes they're unclear, and sometimes they would skip parts of the journey. We wanted to avoid pathos and the illustration of their sufferings. We wanted to show them their routes factually, by facts, he repeats, and thus draw attention to the lack of a humane asylum policy in Europe. So same operation as the forensic oceanography guys. Document the journey using the techniques, again, that a state investigator might do in order to demonstrate the crime not of the journey, but of the necessity of the journey in the first place. So moving a level in what gets exposed. SCART shares this commitment to both factuality and denunciation with the forensic oceanography team and the Arizona border activists. Whether as testimony or as forensic evidence, these projects aim, not despite the fact that they're routinely chronicling catastrophe, but because of it, to leap over the pathos and describe what happened in order to point directly at why it happened. It's as if what happened is bad enough, and often so hard to see or hear, that forcing the rest of us to attend to the journeys so painstakingly reconstructed might better focus our attention on challenging the circumstances that brought them into existence in the first place. So we had one genre of maps made by the state, second genre of maps that kind of echo them inside out, made by civic protesters. These first two genres of maps are made by experts or by those who mediate and facilitate the narratives of refugees and migrants. There remains a third sort of map, in a way the most immediate, if that's a reasonable word to use in describing artifacts from social media. These maps made by and for travelers themselves and exchanged among them. These are maps made by and for travelers themselves and exchanged among them, which need to be treated not only as signs or representations or documents, but also, and in a way more importantly, as actions themselves. The maps are pictures of pathways, instructions for movement, predictions and records of journeys. Journeys, yes, but also operators of that movement and claims. They are the articulation of claims to a fundamental right to move, to exercise agency, to act freely. The images function as both records and instances of agency. And I'll just show you some of these quickly, and then we'll go back through them and I'll talk about them. And I'll explain why you're looking at them. So you see these four maps are identical, actually, just with different graphics. And then these are a different kind of map. And they all come from Facebook. For years, researchers have been following the close proximity of cameras and conflict across the battlefields of the Middle East, from the DIY soldier video of US troops, to Abu Ghraib, to jihadi videotapes of car bombs and suicide missions, to the elaborate productions of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State, and then back to the DIY aesthetic of the Syrian popular uprising. So when a lot of those Iraqi and Syrian phone cameras started taking flight, it was not too hard to notice. But what was different was that the images that emerged were not simply pictures, photographs, or videos of people and buildings, testimonies, documents of destruction or recovery, narratives of events of the sort that cameras have generated basically since their inception. Many of these new images took advantage of other capacities provided by smartphones and larger digital devices. So we could read on the front page of the New York Times in late August 2015, so long summer of migration, the following, which would quickly become a cliche, but was nevertheless quite striking. Here's a quotation from a migrant in the New York Times. "Every time I go to a new country, I buy a SIM card and activate the internet and download the map to locate myself," Osama al-Yassim, a 32-year-old music teacher from Deir al-Zur in Syria, explained as he sat on a broken park bench in Belgrade, staring at his smartphone and plotting his next move into Northern Europe. "I would never have been able to arrive at my destination without my smartphone," he added. And the New York Times comments, "In this modern migration, smartphone maps, global positioning apps, social media, and WhatsApp have become essential tools." Soon, images of maps that bore witness to this phenomenon started appearing in mainstream media. One set of images displayed their practically metastatic spread, and that's this set. So we can leave it at this one. Journalist Jinan Brownell showed a professionally drawn diagram, that's this, on her blog from Belgrade. This is a Belgrade story, I'm realizing, with my friends from Belgrade in the audience. Showed a professionally drawn diagram, something like a flow chart of the journey from Turkey to Germany on her blog from Belgrade in early September. A month later, writing in the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, Gaith Abdul Ahad showed a hand-drawn version of exactly the same image, quote, posted on Facebook by a Kurdish friend of mine in Sulaymaniyah in northern Iraq, with little arrows and stick figures and pictures of a train and boat or two. The diagram shows how to get from Turkey to the German border in 20 easy steps. So you can see, right? In this one, there's fancy like emojis of boats, and in this one, there's hand drawings. And in this one, there's different hand drawings, but it's exactly the same map. Then in November, more or less the same route plan showed up in the news around the world when it was seized from a group of 8 men arrested in Istanbul's airport by the Turkish police and charged as terrorists. The headline over in the Daily Express of London, this was a kind of a calm one, the way to Germany. In the Daily Express in London, the headline was, "Revealed, childish map of route to Germany on scrap of paper hidden on ISIS suspect." Later, our researchers found this. Again, exactly the same map with yet another graphic sensibility. We found the first 2 on Facebook posted in August by an Arabic-speaking user, and a 4th version with this one with these elegant icons posted by another user at the end of the month. Not long after that, it became clear that Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram were serving not simply as spaces of exchange for these images, but also as inadvertent archives. One could look around to see what was circulating and rather quickly assemble a collection of these ad hoc and amateur maps, documents both of route planning and of tracking, helpful advice, records of accomplishments, projections, and expressions of a possible future. We found many of them in a Facebook group called Smuggle Yourself to Europe. They present themselves in a dazzling array of styles, aesthetics, graphics, formats, and software. Their scales range from the continental to the hyper-local, from intercity transport corridors to narrow bodies of water. Some are pictorial, some tracings, some diagrams. Screenshots are annotated with directions, that's this one. Pins are dropped as testimonies, so that's a location in the middle of the water. Pins are dropped as testimonies with coordinates and names. You can see the latitude and longitude at the top there, and other location information. Many of these images offer real-time tracking, guidance about the weather, winds, tides, and warnings. We found an entire archive just of wind and weather screenshots. And warnings, especially about the police and other authorities. So these 2 images come from a detailed sequence of 6 maps accompanied by 4 text images, like this, offered a guide to the route across the border from Serbia to Hungary, and exemplified the granularity of the tactical detail, the confident self-assertion, the instructional rhetoric, the hybrid visual language of map and text and annotation, and the embedded experience that characterize these sorts of images. The annotation announces, "It's obvious from the map." So if the traditional, if we can say that, activist image is designed to document, to raise awareness, as they say, to testify, to narrate or represent an event or a harm or an experience, these images seem very different. Not simply in their aesthetic or their visual language, but in their intentional structure and their mode of functioning. I'll show you a few more. This is my favorite one, and it was posted here in Facebook, and the caption at the top was reposted in Facebook, and the caption in the top says, "This person posted that he arrived in Greece by swimming and explains how." Whoops, sorry. So this is how you walk. The T is Turkish waters, the G is Greek waters. The person describes walking along this mountain ridge, complete with a place to take a rest, and then the most narrow point where you start your swim across to Samos. So, all these maps, and this one in particular, I think is important because it's completely generated by the device itself, the use of the GPS and the pin dropping. And so it felt to me like there was something more than just representation or documentation going on here. So I would propose that they're akin to what the German filmmaker Harun Farokhi called operational images, images created in order to make something happen. Farokhi's examples are the high-tech digital imagery that drives robotic assembly machines in factories, or that allows cruise missiles to direct and redirect their routes by matching one image generated by a nose camera to a stored image, and many others. He referred to them as images not really intended for human eyes, not about representing something, but about making something happen. Now, these are obviously very much intended for human eyes, but they nevertheless function in something like the way that Farokhi proposed. They're made not just to represent or narrate, but to guide. They're instructional, tutorial, something like recipes or algorithms. Sometimes they're automatically generated by plotting newly collected data against stored information. In the case of one WhatsApp archive that we found, created by a group calling itself the Maritime Organization for Following and Rescuing, the images are the records of real-time phone interactions between faraway guides who are following and rescuing, and people in boats making the crossing from Turkey to the Greek islands. Records which are hybrid assemblages of phone calls, messages, photos, GPS-generated location signals, maps, emojis, documents generated in and by the action of movement itself and left behind as guides for future travelers. But if the images are operational, they're also aspirational. Arjun Appadurai has written eloquently about what he calls aspirational maps. The maps were a metaphor for him, visions of a pathway out of the traps of the nation-state and its inevitable production of refugees. But the word tells us something important about how these actual maps do function. Appadurai writes, "There's no doubt that migrants today, as migrants throughout human history, move either to escape horrible lives, to seek better ones, or both. The only new fact in the world of electronic mediation is that the archive of possible lives is now richer and more available to ordinary people than ever before. Thus, there is a greater stock of material from which ordinary people can craft the scripts of possible worlds and imagined selves. This does not mean that the social projects that emerge from those scripts are always liberating or even pleasant, but it is an exercise in the capacity to aspire. Here, these possible worlds start with the route of the journey itself. The aspiration, like the claim to freedom and rights, is instantiated, articulated, and enacted in the journey and its image. The map is the aspiration, the Declaration of Independence, the claim to the right to refuse an intolerable situation and to make something different of one's life. In the summer and fall of 2015, our eyes were trained on the Greek islands, the barred border at Idomeni, and the railway station in Budapest. What became known under the slogan and the hashtag March of Hope was a massive, spontaneous, and performative trek on foot by thousands of people from Budapest to the Austrian border. The German activists Bernd Kasparek and Mark Speer characterized it this way: "The images of this march will surely find their place in the iconography of this long summer of migrations. A long line of people who, after a week of waiting, reappropriated their own mobility and collectively left Budapest. Under the impression of these images and the knowledge that a repressive strategy had failed, Germany and Austria announced that they would open their borders and receive the refugees, whereupon the Hungarian government organized the bus transport to the border. Over the course of that weekend, at least 10,000 refugees reached Germany. The borders were finally open, unquote. By images, they meant the photos and television coverage of the people on the highway, but we can understand their insight more broadly. These images, like the activist maps and the maps made by those on the journey themselves, are part of the journey, part of the claim that the journey constitutes. They enact, demonstrate, put into action the claim for rights and recognition. Some years ago, Jacques Rancière objected to the quasi-realism of Hannah Arendt's critique of human rights as empty in comparison to those of the citizens, and to Agamben's ontological absolutization of that critique. Rancière wrote, that the subject of human rights came into being when people enacted what was previously a mere claim, when they, quote, acted as subjects that did not have the rights they had and had the rights they had not, a famous or infamous formulation. The strength of those rights, he said, lies in the back and forth movement between the first inscription of the right and the dissensual stage on which it's put to the test. Even, he says, the clandestine immigrants in the transit zones of our countries, or the population in refugee camps, can invoke them. These rights are theirs when they can do something with them to construct a dissensus against the denial of rights they suffer. And there are always people among them who do it, unquote. This link between aspiration and operation, between the claim to freedom and rights, and the practical reappropriation of mobility, between the inscription of rights and the enactment of them, may not always succeed. The crisis, not the refugee crisis, but the crisis of the border and migration regimes, is clearly just getting started, and the challenges faced by people seeking recognition and rights are enormous. Some of the border control images bear witness to those challenges. But there are others too, made by those people among them. And the least we can do in the midst of all of this is to pay more careful attention to the things that they say and the images that they create. Thank you.
Thanks so much.